All right, college football is on the horizon. Here to preview the season like nobody else can, renowned bettor Brad Powers. You can follow him if you're not doing so already on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Brad Powers 7. You can also find his work, just about everywhere these days on the Bet the Board podcast, Hit the Books, Free Picks at Covers, and a whole lot more at bradpowersports.com, where you can now find his college football preview, including bets on season win totals, week one, Heisman Trophy winner, national champion, conference futures, plus power ratings and team previews. Brad, it's been a bit since your first appearance on this show back in August of 2022. Loving that Chargers hat you're rocking today. Welcome back to Props and Hops.
Hey, thanks for having me as always. Wow. Yeah, I thought we did it last year. Time flies. It's been 2 years.
Yeah, last year I think I was trying to juggle things around Bet Bash, and I did a rare rebroadcast just to get something out there for people, but I feel like it's a good chance to refresh the process and just look at a lot of what's new in the landscape of college football entering the 2024 season. Before we start to dig in too much, I want to give a shout out to all those who are already joining us live across Twitter and YouTube. Thank you for tuning in. Feel free to jump in the chat with any thoughts or questions along the way, and we'll weave that into the show where possible. Brad, to kick things off, in addition to all the other places where you're providing content, you did a great interview recently with our good friend Sammy P on the Chicken Dinner podcast. I enjoyed listening to that one from Bet Bash. I'll try to advance rather than repeat too much of that conversation. But I recall your first comment being something along the lines of there's no offseason anymore. And I'm wondering what your so-called offseason looks like now compared to even just a couple years ago.
Yeah, a good question. I mean, it's twofold. On one hand, the reason there's no offseason is these books are posting numbers earlier and earlier. I mean, you could have bet the Ohio State-Michigan game for this season during the national championship game last season, and win totals were up in February. That's never been the case. Then you couldn't bet a UTEP win total, but you could bet Michigan's win total in February and a lot of the power teams. So there's more of a sense of urgency there. And then more specific on why there's no offseason is there's just a lot more roster turnover in college football due to the transfer portal. So instead of having a 25% roster overhaul, it's closer to 40%. And then obviously you have your teams with first year coaches that, I mean, heck, 80% of your roster is completely new from just one season. So that requires a heck of a lot more work. So I mean, I guess how it's changed is I used to really be heavily involved betting and handicapping college hoops, and I just can't do that anymore. I mess around a little bit with the NCAA tournament, but I don't bet the regular season anymore.
Well, sticking with the focus on college football, you touched on one of, I think, a handful of macro level changes I have top of mind. Of the 5 topics, the expanded college football playoff, conference realignment, new this year NFL-style helmet communications, as you touched on, the continued evolution of the transfer portal and NIL. Also, some coaching turnover at the top. Nick Saban retiring, Jim Harbaugh being off to the NFL, representing, I guess I'll say, our Chargers for the purposes of this conversation. Brad, considering all these high-level changes, how has that affected your preparation process from a betting perspective?
Yeah, I don't have the scientific data on the 2-minute warning and the headset and the helmet communication. I mean, the thought process is it could lead to some higher scoring games. I haven't somebody tell me that it's worth 1.4 points, and we haven't seen any movement yet in week one. And week one's kind of tough because generally speaking, week one's lower scoring compared to the rest of the season. So let me get back to you as far as those rule changes. I think the more prominent change this year, as far as how did it impact my betting, would be the playoff, the move to 12 teams. And it's a new market that I love betting. You can bet yes or no. Will a team make the playoff? Will they not? So that's fun. I'm also excited to see if that market stays up all season, because I'd like to bet that. Do I want to lay minus 600 Georgia's going to make the playoff right now? Yeah, maybe that would be the way to go. But I'd much rather lay a little bit cheaper number if Georgia loses a game during the regular season, whether, I jump in, yeah, they're going to make the playoff, or yeah, they're going to win the national championship, and kind of buy a low spot, whether it's Georgia, Ohio State, or any of the teams at the top. So that to me is a little bit interesting. But also at the top of college football, how is rivalry week going to be? I'm a little, worried because conference championships are everything. The winner gets the top 4 seed. And it doesn't matter if you're 9-3 and you get to the conference championship game, you win at conference championship game, you're a Big 12 team or an ACC team, you are getting a top 4 seed and a bye. The conference championship game means that much more. Are you going to be optimal on rivalry week when the conference championship game is on deck? I'm not sure. I think some teams that might be a little less optimal in those situations. So that is preventing me at the top of college football. Look, you used to have a sense of urgency. You had to win every game. You can maybe only lose one to get in. Now, get in with a couple losses. I mean, it's more of the NFL model. So I just think there's a less sense of urgency on a week-to-week basis.
I'm going to go out of order here and jump in with something I was planning to run by you toward the end of this conversation. But as you touch on a potential lack of urgency, what's rivalry week going to look like? That really brings to the forefront that I think the most common argument I've heard against the expanded playoff would be that it can hurt the regular season. And I'll play devil's advocate and just humor me a bit, then I'll be wide open to your perspective on my take. I feel like, if anything, it could actually help the regular season in a lot of ways that I'm not hearing from other people. And part of this probably ties in with my personal experience as a USC student going back to 2007, if I can date myself a bit here. John David Booty breaks his finger. They lose 2 games in October. They win every other game, including the Rose Bowl, finish 11-2, ranked second in the coaches poll. They get a first place vote in the AP poll, but they didn't get to play for the championship, and their last month plus of the regular season significantly lost its luster. The next season, 2008, throttle Ohio State in the home opener, follow that up with a dud at Oregon State, and that's all she wrote. They finished 12-1 this time, including another Rose Bowl victory, again number 2 in the coaches poll, again getting a first place vote in the AP poll, but their championship hopes were all but gone before the end of September. Now, admittedly, this was during the BCS era. The 4-team playoff was a big step in the right direction. I'd say the 12-team playoff we get this year, an even bigger step in the right direction. I kind of like the fact that it gives contenders the ability to overcome a couple of losses throughout the season. And if anything, to me, it increases the number of teams with championship aspirations throughout the regular season. I get that it's very easy and natural to point to rivalry week, something like Ohio State, Michigan, in a battle of unbeatens with everything on the line under the previous format. I guess my counter would be that this new structure can increase the relevance of a lot more late season games involving teams whose records aren't perfect. And for most teams, they're not going to be by the time we get to rivalry week. And also this limits a scenario like last year when Florida State goes undefeated, wins a Power 4 conference, but doesn't get in. Lastly, Brad, then I'll hand it back over to you. If we consider the NFL for a second, again, going back to 2007, so maybe I'm just dating myself too much here, but the Patriots start 18-0, and then they're stunned by the Giants in the Super Bowl to derail their perfect season. I haven't heard anybody complain that the Giants lost 6 games in that regular season, snuck into the playoffs as a wild card team. Ironically, the same year that an 11-2 USC team doesn't get a shot at the college football title. I'm not saying to let everybody in, but I wonder what you may think I'm missing about the potential pitfalls of this 12-team format compared to more exclusive and convoluted formats of the past.
Well, I'm not sure that I could said it better myself. Probably if you'd asked me this question 5 years ago, oh yeah, you got to keep the regular season intact. Now, certainly more games are going to matter, more teams are going to be in the mix. I don't know if it necessarily means just because you can make the playoff, there's going to be a difference between you can make the playoff or you can win a national title. I still think there's only a few schools that can actually win a playoff format and win 3-4 big time games in a row. But with that being said, yeah, more games are going to matter, more teams are going to be in it. I'm generally excited. But you also brought up that the pitfall is going to be the biggest games of the college football regular season are going to mean less. So those top 4 or 5 games of the regular season that we've been accustomed to, Michigan, Ohio State's probably the best example last 3 years. The fact that they could meet again, they're no more division in Big Ten, no more division. So the fact that they're both 11-0 and they can play each other back-to-back weeks, that certainly loses the luster of that game in the regular season, to say the least. And no matter what, even the team could lose 2 of those games and still make the playoffs. That's the downfall of that. But outside of them top 4 or 5 games in the regular season, it should be better for the rest of college football.
And when it comes to that possible lack of urgency, I'm reminded of a mantra on this show. I think I referenced it last time we connected. Chaos breeds opportunity. In this case, I'm wondering if you have much of a game plan or anything you're anticipating if we get to some of those occasional spots where maybe one or both teams will lack urgency in a game due to the expanded playoff, maybe some load management going on. Anything you're anticipating if and when we get to those points so that you're ready to fire on some edges that haven't existed under previous formats.
Yeah, again, to bring it up, that rivalry week, just load management maybe. And I'm not even saying the big games, Ohio State, Michigan. Let's just use Georgia Tech. Georgia, that sometimes you've already said, hey, with the SEC championship game, how important is this game? Now I think it's even less important. So, I mean, when they're laying 28, 35 points against a rival with the chip on their shoulder, I'm probably going to be betting a little bit more. I'm just speaking. I'm guessing I'm going to have more dog tickets at the end, when I do think there is going to be some load management at the end of the season among the contenders. I will see. Maybe it gets priced in and maybe that theory goes out the window, but I definitely think that'll be different.
All right. Well,
and I'm not willing to say, and could we go as so far like a Carson Beck sits a game? I mean, you would think not. It's college football. We're not accustomed to that. But again, we're going more towards the NFL model. Is Patrick Mahomes playing in week 17, week 18? He's not. So could we see that in college football? I think we could.
Building on that last point, I recall being at Bet Bash attending a college football seminar, and I think Brett McMurphy mentioned that the last player to win the Heisman Trophy while missing a game that season was Charlie Ward in the early 90s. Do you think that factors into the consciousness if you're looking to bet a Heisman Trophy winner entering the market mid to late season who might have a de facto bye as their team preps for playoff positioning, and how you might want to look at other Heisman candidates instead?
That's an excellent question. Something I haven't completely wrapped my head around pricing, but the Heisman Trophy, awards become more of a, flavor of the month. Whoever plays the best in the month of November in the biggest games usually wins it among contending teams. So, if they sit out one of them games, yeah, I mean, that could impact it. I don't know yet. I don't have data. I'm a big data guy. I want to see the data, and we don't have any data. So there's so much change in college football that I almost feel like I got to wait. I definitely think I could price uncertainty better, but there's even maybe in this case too much uncertainty for me to be, slam dunk on my fist. Oh, I'm not worried about Carson Beck, winning the Heisman. I did bet him to win the Heisman, or Dylan Gabriel doing the Heisman. I did bet him this year because they sit a game or two. I don't know.
That's a very fair answer for this stage before week 0 has even gotten rolling. But Brad, building on the concept of load management, a few other betting concepts I'd like to run by you. Let's say 5 of them, and I'll run these by you through the lens of specific teams. I'd like to start with Ohio State and the perhaps optimal paths to fading a public darling. I know that very relatively speaking, I gather that you're bearish on the Buckeyes. You still make them number 2 for what it's worth, so you can't be that low on them. But considering this can all be relative to price points and other market evaluations, not to repeat too much of what you've said and written elsewhere, for this audience, before I run a specific couple of questions by you, I guess could we get maybe 30 seconds or so on why you feel as if you could be relatively low on Ohio State?
I don't think I'm relatively low, to be honest with you. Again, you mentioned they're number 2 in my power ratings. I'm low compared to the people that think this is, one of the best teams in recent college football history. I don't see that. They don't have the quarterback, in my opinion. There's still question marks, in my opinion, about Ryan Day in big time games. So, and I think the offensive line is still a little bit of an issue. Defensive line to me in the 3 biggest games got run over late in the game against Notre Dame, Michigan, and Missouri. So to me, that's still a little bit of an issue, even though all those guys are back. So I guess I'm just bearish compared to the people out there like Urban Meyer says it's the most talented roster and that he's seen recently in college football. A guy that I really respect as far as a college football guy that's in the space thinks Ohio State by far is the best team entering this season. Again, I still have Georgia slightly better. It's not that I'm way down on Ohio State. It's not like I bet under 10.5 wins. It's just I don't see slam dunk. This is going to be the national championship team this year.
Got it. I appreciate the clarification on your stance there. So I guess if we are maybe to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who is relatively down on the Buckeyes, you touched on the low-hanging fruit, something like under 10.5 wins. Best available price I've seen recently was plus 153 at Chris or Bookmaker. And throughout this show, I'll be citing the best available prices from my research. I wonder if, aside from a season win total, if somebody doesn't like the Buckeyes, would you consider something like maybe being bearish enough to lay minus 485 on no to win the national championship, or taking something like plus 575 to miss the playoff, both of those odds coming from Circa? Any thought on those angles to perhaps expand the attack surface?
Yeah, I think if you're bearish, even more than me, under 10.5 wins, because I mean, there is 2 critical road games where I have bet against Ohio State in those 2 games, at Oregon and Penn State. They could easily lose those games. I don't want to really, I want to, lay a lot. I mean, no to win the national championship, I think is fine. I just think most listeners probably don't want to lay nearly $5 to win $1 at this point and have that money tied up. But to miss the playoff is another thing. They're going to have to lose 3 games. And I just don't see that. It would have to be an absolute, multiple quarterbacks get hurt for them to lose 3 games. I think I'm even pushing it for them to lose a couple games. So, I think under 10.5 wins at plus money would be fine with me, because they're right now an underdog in that Oregon game.
When it comes to that steep price for Ohio State not to win the title, or off the top, you mentioned the steep price on Georgia to make the playoff. I know if we're talking in the minus 500, minus 600 range, to your point, that can be off-putting to a lot of people, especially before the season has even begun. But if we fast forward a few months, and maybe these are scenarios where you're not tying up your bankroll for nearly as long, maybe the prices are even a bit steeper, but the turnaround to recognizing the payout, if and when these bets cash, would be advantageous. Any thought as to not firing now, but maybe mid to late season, reconsidering markets like that where you would be laying some serious lumber?
I absolutely anticipate I'll have bets in that market throughout the season on both Ohio State and Georgia to make the playoff. My anticipation is they're going to trip up somewhere, maybe even twice. I mean, look at both teams. I mentioned Ohio State's road schedule. I mean, Penn State and Oregon, the 2 toughest teams on their schedule, both on the road. Georgia's even in a worse situation where the 3 best teams on their schedule, Alabama, Texas, and Ole Miss, are all on the road for them. So I think both teams are going to trip up somewhere. And that's where, in the middle of October, if I want to lay minus 400, minus 500 instead of minus 600 in August or July, it just becomes more attractive to me.
Understood. All right, well, let's move on to another team and another concept here. I'd like to focus on Texas for a little bit and the value of half a win. I think I've heard you mention the rule of thumb being 70 cents. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that could be worth more at the extremes, thinking that not all half wins are created equal. So looking at a team like Texas, if you want the best price on under 10 wins, minus 104 at Bookmaker, the best price on under 10.5, minus 178 at FanDuel, we're looking at a 74-cent delta there. Again, the rule of thumb being 70 cents, that would imply to lay less vig on the under 10. But I wonder if somebody feels inclined to fade Texas, with this being their first season in the SEC, is it fair to say that it's worth laying a little bit of that extra vig to play under 10.5, turning a potential 10-2 season from a push into a win?
I couldn't have said it better the way you described it. I think at the polar opposites, whether it's at the top of college football, your 10.5 win total, 11 win total in some seasons, and at your bottom where you have 1.5, 2s, 2.5s, those half wins, in my opinion, are probably closer to 80 cents, maybe even more, because there's just, you're not dealing with the entirety of the schedule. There's only a finite number of games. In Texas's case, maybe only 3-4 games on their schedule that are losable. So that half win to me means that much more. So if you're asking me what I would prefer to bet, I'd rather lay the little bit extra on the delta there on the juice on the under 10.5. Because you start getting to three losses, then every game that's in question is going to have to be a loss for Texas.
All right. Good to know on the value at the extremes, maybe approaching 80%, if 80 cents, if not a touch more, when we're talking half a win in the regular season win total market. And if we want to expand the scope beyond regular season win total markets, next team and concept I wanted to run by you, Penn State, and the notion of bet this, not that, to quote Bud Elliott from the aforementioned Bet Bash College Football Seminar. This will be kind of similar to the Ohio State concept, but potentially to back a team rather than fading it. In the regular season win total market, best price available over 9.5 for the Nittany Lions, minus 163 at Bookmaker. The best price in a different market, yes to make the playoff, minus 140 at DraftKings. different bets on a similar outcome here. And Brad, I'm wondering if somebody's inclined to back Penn State and thinks 10 plus wins gives them at least an 85% chance to make the playoff. The better bet is probably to pass on the regular season win number and just lay less vig on the yes to make the playoff. Also thinking that betting into DraftKings is almost always the better bet than taking on Bookmaker to the extent that you can get down at DraftKings. Does this logic check out in your book?
It does. I would rather to make the playoff at 20 cents. I don't think there's enough where it's slam dunk, the much better bet, though. Because, I mean, if you're just looking at Penn State's schedule, say they go 10-2, where are the quality wins? I mean, I'm likely thinking if they went 10-2, they lost to Ohio State and then somebody else. Well, where are the quality? If they didn't beat anybody and there's like a 9-3 Alabama or somebody else that they're compared to that has more wins, I could see. I don't have to get too creative to paint a scenario where Penn State's not in the playoff even at 10-2. So I certainly would at this point rather have the minus 140 than the minus 163. But I don't think there's a big enough difference where it's absolutely much better, because I think there is a case where they don't make it at 10-2.
I appreciate that call out.
I have bet both though. I have bet them to make the playoff, and I bet over 9.5.
All right, good to know. And I appreciate that clarification you made, because again, these are different bets on similar outcomes, not different bets on the same outcome. So It is worth keeping in mind that if you assume 10-2 gets them into the playoff, that is not set in stone at this point. Brad, to that end, any other perspective on angles similar to this that could involve any number of other teams where you're just looking to go beyond some of the mainstream markets and, to use a phrase I used earlier in the show, really expand that attack surface?
Oh, wow. Good question. Similar to Penn State's philosophy, shopping Alabama to getting a plus number for them to make the playoff. Because I could paint a scenario where I think, the win total is 9.5 with the under slightly juiced. Obviously you can bet under 9.5 wins. You can get over 9.5 wins at plus money, but you can also get them to make the playoff at plus money. And I would rather have that, because I think there's a scenario where Alabama can still make it at 9-3. So to me, that's a bet that I made this week where I'd rather have, instead of the plus money going over 9.5 wins, give me the plus money on Alabama to make the playoff, because you could still go 9-3 and still make it, if that makes sense. I guess the other one that's new for me this year would be we all know that the group of 5 team gets an automatic bid. So I treated it like it's a separate market. Who are the 5 or 6 teams that are most likely, in my opinion, to make the playoff out of the group of 5? And obviously I leveraged, obviously shopped around, bet teams at different amounts, but I pinpointed the 5 or 6 teams that I think are most likely to make it, and any one of the 5 or 6 make the playoff, I make some money. So that was a different strategy, that a different market that I hadn't had in recent years. Now, obviously, I could be way wrong, and all 5 or 6 could not make it, but I think the chances of me cashing in that market are above 70%.
Another new wrinkle this year can lead us to the next team and concept I wanted to run by you. My alma mater, the USC Trojans, but something that could work against them. I'm thinking about a subtle incumbent advantage, or perhaps a newcomer disadvantage with regard to realignment. This also courtesy of something I took away from Bud Elliott. Incumbents having an edge over newcomers, even if it's a relatively lateral move for the newcomers, such as USC's move from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten. We're not talking group of 5 to Power 4 here, where there's an obvious step up in class for the newcomer. Also, not even focusing this on travel. It's well known that teams like USC will be traveling greater distances with greater frequency. Also, weird kickoff times. It's well known at this stage, teams like USC will have more 9 a.m. body clock kickoffs, although I am intrigued to see how an 11 p.m. body clock kickoff will affect East Coast teams playing late games out west, like Rutgers at USC on October 25th. But what I wanted to dig into here, Brad, would be this subtle incumbent advantage through the lens of USC jumping to the Big Ten and the learning curve that these newcomers could face. Thinking of it through the standpoint of Ohio State has 1 new team on its conference schedule this year to learn. USC has to learn 7. My sense is that this will be more of a cumulative effect between the level of competition, the travel, and this familiarity, among other factors. And I just feel like that learning curve gets less talk than any of the other factors at this point, and it may matter as much as any one individual factor. Kind of has me feeling right now like if USC goes over 7.5 wins, that could be a bigger accomplishment than a lot of people would realize, if that even happens. What's your perspective on this and how the incumbent advantage could possibly reduce learning curve and give a leg up to teams already in conferences that are seeing realignment?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that thought process there. I do think there's an advantage for the teams not, making the jump. So a negative on the Oregons, the USCs, particularly. I think the teams, not necessarily Oregon and USC, I think they can handle a little bit better. But the other two teams in that Big Ten, they're jumping to the Big Ten, Washington and UCLA with two new coaches. Not going to be a good look, in my opinion. And if you don't believe me, the market has been significantly in most markets against Washington, UCLA. I mean, it's just simple math. I mean, you got to prep for 7, 8 new opponents. Everybody else has to prep for 1 or 2. That requires extra time, the extra travel. I do think, I'll just say this, I'll throw this back to you. We're talking about college kids, 20 years old, body clock wise. I think the answer is they can adjust to 11 p.m. The Rutgers to USC, they'll be okay, I think, compared to somebody having to play a football game at 9 a.m. Generally speaking, college kids are more night owls than early birds. So I think that is a negative for USC. And it's always number specific to me. It all comes, I mean, yeah, I can put that in there and factor that in. But with all that being said, I bet USC's win total over. I think the team's not being respected enough in the market. I like this team compared to at least market aspirations. I'm not alone because seems like there's been a little bit more positivity on them in the market. So it's always a case by case basis. I do think they play the second toughest schedule in the country, besides all the travel, just opponent specific. So I do worry about teams like that getting run down and a new league being maybe even a little bit more physical. But with all that being said, is that appropriately priced in the market or not? I didn't think some early markets it was probably maybe overcompensated, and the loss of Caleb Williams overcompensated into it. So I'm not doing this just because I'm on the show wearing a Chargers hat and being pro USC. I'm all about being pro my wallet, and I kind of like USC this year, even with all those negative connotations out there.
Music to my ears. I also caught up with Matt Metcalf for a hot minute at Bet Bash, and he mentioned that he was bullish on the Trojans. So I like getting out of my Southern California bubble and hearing what very well-informed bettors are thinking, because in my local bubble here, I feel like Lincoln Riley's taking a lot of heat. And I'd love to get your thought for a moment on the job he's done so far, because on one hand, he inherited a bare cupboard when it came to both talent on the roster and any NIL infrastructure. I think he deserves some time to rebuild. On the other hand, I get there was major regression from year 1 to year 2. He waited way too long to fire defensive coordinator Alex Grinch. He still seems to refuse to address special teams or recruiting in California in a meaningful way. So I wonder if you could share a thought from your perspective on the job he's done so far, and maybe elaborate just a bit on the Trojans' outlook as they enter the Big Ten.
Well, I think his biggest problem was the success came immediately, probably too soon, too quick, jumped off to an 11-1 start. People are thinking, well, if he can, take over a 4-18, win 11 games year 1, I mean, where can this national title contender? And you're right. I mean, there was a lot more underneath the surface, a lot more big time problems for USC than that could not get corrected in a matter of a year or two. Now, some of it, like you mentioned, self-inflicted, needed to probably get rid of Grinch after year 1. Didn't. He was loyal to his guy. Now, I will say, I thought he went out and hired an all-star caliber defensive staff. Coaching won't be the issue. If it is the issue on the defensive side, it's going to – I think the personnel isn't quite there yet, but that should be one of the more improved defenses in the country just because of the staff. Now, are they going to become the 85 Chicago Bears overnight? No. I don't know if they'll ever get there with Lincoln Riley, just because he's so much more of an offensive-minded coach. But I like what he did there. You mentioned, I know this is in the weeds, I'd like to see a little bit more recruiting. I know the NIL and whatnot's probably not up to snuff compared to a Georgia, but you mentioned it. I mean, there is no reason a Southern California kid, elite player, he should be getting a majority of those guys. Just that has to be the reality if USC is going to get back to where they were in the heyday of the Pete Carroll era. So I have not seen that yet. I'm a little bit worried the conference that they're joining. And I said I just bet them over the win total, but the win total that I bet was 7, You're talking, if you'd have told a USC fan that after that 11-1 start, hey, in year 3, the win total is going to be 7.5, they would have been stunned at that. So it's all relative to market expectations, but this is a big year for him. Not that he has to go out and win 10 games, but they can't get embarrassed in some of these games at Michigan. The openers, the entire nation is going to be watching that because it's a standalone game. The defense has to be better. He just kind of, I don't want to use the word survives, but they just have to look functional. Like some of the base level is there where you can, pinpoint where, hey, in year 4 is going to be a year where they can take off and be a Big Ten contender. Because I don't see that yet this year.
That really resonates with me in terms of how they look, not just what their record is, but
Yes.
what things look like week to week. Because last year, speaking of 9 a.m. Pacific time kickoffs, they went to Colorado and the Buffaloes gave them fits in the second half, and USC almost let a big lead slip away. So even when they were undefeated prior to the Notre Dame game, they did not have the look on the field of an undefeated team. So plenty to be seen in year 3 of the Lincoln Riley era at USC for a lot of the listeners.
You like that look in the bowl game, though, didn't you? That's the USC you want to see.
There we go.
Obviously, the result was good, but you saw them flying around the football on defense, and not that they had great personnel. You saw some excitement, some sense of urgency. They were flat in a lot of games. The UCLA game, low energy. That's what I'm looking for USC this year. From game 1 to game 12, not that you got to be up for every single game, but I felt like they, took the entire games off, entire second half against Colorado. That happened 4 or 5 times last year. That cannot happen this year.
Yeah, and I struggle to incorporate that into my betting approach because I can probably err on the side of being more analytical and objective, and I'll take that compared to the trade-offs of being too far the other way. But I feel like somebody like Miller Moss, as a fan, he is so easy to root for, I think, within the locker room. Not that I think some of the Caleb Williams drama off the field was overblown as part of the NFL draft process, as it always is when you're talking about a guy at the top of the board. But Miller Moss sticking with the program through thick and thin, now getting his shot. I don't know how to quantify it, but I feel like that could only be a positive if it matters in any material way when it comes to what he brings to the locker room and the home crowd.
Agree. Don't ask me, what's that worth? 3/4 of a point. I can't pinpoint that, but if you had a team chemistry better this year than last year for USC, I would be betting the yes if I could make a prop bet.
Well, one thing you can pinpoint by the looks of it is how to bet Colorado's regular season win total, because, Brad, they're the next team I want to talk about, and the concept here being hedging versus identifying standalone value across different bets. You have them in pocket under 6.5 wins, and then over 4.5 wins coming back the other way. Current line 5.5 shaded to the over. So needless to say, you've put yourself in a beautiful position where you can't lose both bets, and either 5 or 6 wins cashes both tickets for you. Brad, how much was the over 4.5 win bet a shot for the middle here to cash both tickets with 5 or 6 wins? And how much of it was just because at that point there was enough of a swing where you saw standalone value in that over 4.5?
I thought both were standalone value. The first original under 6.5 was kind of a prop bet that I made back in December. So I didn't get a full unit, at least a typical unit size for me down on that. That would be my preference under 6.5 compared to the over 4.5. But I just thought when the 4.5 became available, this was something that I bet early spring, like March. Colorado, the hype machine was going to get there. I thought, well, I don't think we're going to see 4.5. It's only going to go up from here. It's all number specific, throughout the course of this offseason. Obviously, it's a roster that continues to turn over. But I've been right, pretty lockstep, right around 5, I think is the most. 5 and 7 is the most likely scenario. You look at their schedule, it's a little tough in the fact that there's no surefire losses on the schedule, but there's no surefire wins. I also tend to, be a little bit pessimistic on them just because I think there's the word maybe combustible. I just, there could be, obviously Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, their 2 best players. Well, they're not coming back to Colorado next year. So at the end of the season, is there some load management there when they're thinking NFL? I think there could be that. We've seen Coach Prime, even during fall camp, there's, combustible with the media. How does that play out? Didn't play out well last year. Off to a hot start. Everyone's praising them up. They had some adversity. They didn't respond well to that adversity. I still don't think that the roster is completely, he's certainly upgraded the talent, to say the least. He's upgraded the power rating. If it wasn't for the whole circus that surrounds Colorado, I would say Coach Prime's done a wonderful job. I mean, their power rating from what he inherited to now is 2 touchdowns plus better. So he's done a wonderful job in that regard. It's always compared to expectations, and the expectations among the certain segment of the fan base is this is a Big 12 contending team. This is an 8-9 win team. I do not see that. So what I did was I knew I had 2 good positions there, but what I wanted at the end of summer was to let's pound the fist on the table. What position do I really like here? And what position would I prefer? And Circa had 6 available, and I hit that a couple of times. So my preferred position, I'll be happy if Colorado is still 4-8, and I lose that original bet because I got a lot more on the under at this point.
All right, Brad. Well, up to this point in the conversation, we've touched on 5 macro factors and how they have influenced your betting approach, 5 betting concepts through the lens of specific teams. I guess 5 will be the number of this episode because I'd also like to touch on 5 futures markets, making these more quick hitters, not necessarily pressing for any bets to give out, but perhaps some quick thoughts or advice for up and coming bettors based on the current state of the markets. I'd like to start with regular season win totals. I know it's been up for a while. If somebody's just starting to look into it now, as we're basically on the eve of week 0, any thought for how somebody may want to approach looking at that regular season win total market?
Yeah, it's still you're tying up your money for 3-4 months still. Obviously the market's pretty liquid at this point in that market, but it still comes down to the basics. Shop. I mean, there's still half win differences. Now the juice has become tighter and tighter, but man, we said it, a half win maybe doesn't sound like much, but it's 70 cents. So as always, shop. I mean, you'd be surprised to see even at late summer that there's still, differences of a half wins for a lot of teams. So make sure you could do yourself wonders going from 1-2 outs to 5 or 6 in that market. I would say generally speaking, bet on news. A quarterback, week 1's going to get taken down off quarterback gets hurt. We'll use the most extreme example. I mean, obviously week 1's going to get impacted first thing off the board. Some of these other markets are a little bit slower off the board. So and when you get that news, maybe you don't get that first 10 seconds on the week 1. Sometimes they some books, not all, but some are a little slower to react on the win total. So that's usually when I'm betting a win total this point in the season, that's what I'm betting on. It's just strictly news.
I really like that angle, tying back to the thought of expanding the attack surface. If you can find something a bit downstream, slower to move, that can be where some of the biggest edges will come up between now and the time that we crown our national champion. Brad, before a team can win the national title, in all likelihood, we're going to be looking at a conference champion, unless it's one of those runners-up in probably the Big Ten or SEC with the ability to make a playoff run. What are your initial quick thoughts on the conference championship markets that are out there?
It's probably my favorite market. It's the one I've had most success. Now, I won't have success if there's a lot of long shots, but I do bet typically 3-4 teams in each individual conference. Sometimes in a couple conferences, I'll take some long shots. I thought new to this season, there's some more wide open conferences at the top. ACC and Big 12 are as wide open as a power conference as I've seen in the last decade. So I took a little bit more flyers with teams in that 15-1 range that I normally wouldn't. So that's what's been different. Are you betting it now? No, there's too much theoretical hold. And I think the teams, at least that I perceive to have value, have gone from like 15-1 down to 8-1. Bets that I'm just not making at this point.
Anything different when it pivots from a look at the conference championship markets to yes or no options out there on teams to essentially make or miss the expanded college football playoff?
I think I kind of touched on this earlier. I'm more interested in this market playing on teams to yes after losses. Losses that, it's obviously going to come down to look and why did they lose the game. But if it's expected losses or it's a 50-50 game, they lose it and I get that better price on a Georgia or Ohio State, that's where I'll be involved in the market.
That makes all the sense in the world. And I wonder what you expect in the way of the market reacting, because in previous years, not even going back as far as those 2007 and 2008 USC teams I mentioned, but one loss could really break a team's season, no matter when it came. Now, it's common knowledge that with the expanded playoff, things can be a little bit more forgiving. So I think your angle makes a lot of sense, but do you think the betting market will also be on to that? Or do you expect there to be a bit of a disconnect as people catch on to this newly expanded playoff format?
I don't know. First year, I'm not even sure. There's a couple books that have told me they're not going to keep this market up on a week to week basis. So I'm really uncertain to see. I'll give you another example that I haven't talked about. I think it's a really good one. Is Notre Dame to make the playoff right now is like minus 160, minus 170. I don't want to bet it, but if Notre Dame, and this is a scenario where I'm okay laying a worse number. If they beat Texas A&M in the opener, their toughest game of the season, they're a 3-point underdog. I'd much more want to, fist on the table. They're going to make the playoffs and lay a minus 250, a minus 300 after a game, lay a worse price because, right now I don't think they're going to win that game. But boy, if they do, that's one where I'll jump in. So again, certain scenarios, I'm much more interested on week to week basis right now, but betting the yes, no's on those playoffs. That's if they keep them up. Again, some have said that they won't.
That angle reminds me a lot of conversations I've had with bettors like Hitman over the years, looking at the NFL draft. Initially, odds come out and you may see a small edge here or there, but waiting for solid news to come in. And if you can be quick to the trigger, or even if you're a bit delayed and you end up laying a steeper price, if you are 50-50 on something that's priced at even money, you could be better off laying minus 500 if you're suddenly 95% certain that that's going to happen because of information that has been solidified. I mean, nothing gets much more solid than data points and final scores from games that count. So I really hear you when it comes to bets like Notre Dame to possibly make the playoff after they have a big matchup early on, like Texas A&M. And Brad, when we get some of those marquee matchups, whether it's early or late in the season, that of course can influence the Heisman betting market. Any quick thought on how you're approaching the Heisman market this coming season?
Unfortunately, it's a market that's starting to get, I don't want to say priced out because it's still one of my favorite, but boy, it's been obviously a quarterback award on a contending team. The contending teams now is expanded. So in theory, I should have more Heisman bets this year. Reality is I have less because unfortunately the hold, at least from what I've seen, is greater for the sports book. So guys like, like I'll use an example. Hendon Hooker from Tennessee just 2 years ago was like 80-1 preseason to win the Heisman. And there he is in the middle of November, the Heisman favorite. Similar situation. They have, a quarterback in Nico Iamaleava at Tennessee this year in a very offensive quarterback friendly system. He hasn't played in his career like Hendon Hooker had multiple years as starting quarterback at Virginia Tech. So what's Nico's odds? Is it similar to 80-1 or is it, maybe it's a little less, 60-1? No, his odds are like 30-1 preseason. So the market's just on top of it where I typically had, 4 or 5 bets of guys 60-1, 80-1, and I just don't have it this year. A lot of those types of guys have been priced out where they're making almost everybody 30-1 preseason.
Well, if a lot of value has been sucked out of the Heisman market, I think the big one that everybody's going to be watching, that most books will be keeping up throughout the entire season to win the national championship. Any thoughts on that market preseason and perhaps how you'll be viewing it over the course of the season?
See, with the playoff now, I mean, obviously it's a top-heavy sport, but I mean, now we got a playoff where they got to win 3 games. I just think you're going to be better with a mechanical money line rollover, a mechanical parlay. So I'm not really that involved in the national title futures market.
Makes a lot of sense. The mechanical parlay is often a way to extract more value at the end of the day if your bet comes through, and also to have the flexibility for a ripcord if anything changes to give yourself that out. So I hear you there, Brad. One more process-driven betting question before we hop into a couple of pillars of this show. I'm curious about your process behind betting on or against specific teams, perhaps entering futures markets, through the prism of, I think you've explained your conservative nature when it comes to adjusting teams year over year in power ratings compared to what a lot of the market does. I think that you mentioned maybe a team like Miami, maybe Iowa. I'm trying to recall that chicken dinner conversation with Sammy P, but I think there were multiple teams that you have upgraded significantly, but the market has upgraded them even further. Maybe you just want to see some data before you take that additional step. What are you watching for early on this season to determine just how aggressively to further adjust your numbers?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you got to be a little bit more aggressive to start the season because that's the only data point. You don't want to overreact, but I mean, 2 games usually are enough for me to be like, okay, I was dead right on this team or I was dead wrong on this team. But you're right with what you said. Naturally, I'm a little bit more conservative. But that being said, last couple of years, what's been the difference? Well, I got a lot more teams that I've upgraded, or I would say more teams I've downgraded. Double digits, the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 points. That just never happened. I mean, sometimes most seasons, my biggest downgrade might have been a touchdown on a team. But now we have teams that new coaches have 2 returning starters. I mean, normally that would be just an absolute dumpster fire in most college football seasons. So I'm still. You mentioned Iowa. I think the market on an Iowa, looks like they've upgraded their power rating 13, 14 points from last year. I can't get there on a team to me, that's low variance. I mean, we know what Iowa football is. I know the offense really, really bottomed out at last year, but there's not enough variance in that program to say with a 25-year coach that's been there a quarter century to say, let's go ahead and upgrade their power rating, 10 plus points. I'm never going to be that type of guy.
And if you're watching much Iowa football, odds are it might be fingernails on a chalkboard kind of stuff for a good chunk of the season. So you may feel inclined to turn to the hops. Let's weave in that portion of the conversation. Brad, a couple of years ago, you mentioned that you weren't drinking as much as you'd used to, but your go-to was the old-fashioned at Vegas Vicky's at Circa. What would you say is your go-to come summer of 2024?
Still that. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I
Right.
don't drink as much as I used to. I wish I cut out the eating as much as I had the drinking. I mean, that's still a problem for me. But yeah, over under on a weekly consumption of alcohol beverages. If you set it at 1, the under would be juiced slightly per week. So I really have cut back. But yeah, it's still, I'm a guy that goes out maybe once a month, has 3 or 4 old fashioned, whether it's at Vegas Vicky's or pretty much anywhere that has a good solid old fashioned. This is my go-to drink.
Nice. And if anybody's curious about my answer to that question, I've got this shirt on, Pliny for President. This is a beer that Russian River makes. It's a play on their renowned Pliny the Elder West Coast IPA. So during an election cycle like this, they have some fun with their beer names and juice it up a bit. That's definitely been one of my go-tos for the summer of 2024. And if anybody's listening in California, they've got one more batch coming up soon before the election that you can have shipped to your door anywhere in the state of California. But for the non-hop heads, Brad, we'll go ahead and move this right along to the Malinsky Minute as a nod to the late, great David Malinsky. I've got a 2-parter for you. I think I threw you a 2-parter last time as well. Part 1 this time around. Your last appearance on the show, you mentioned that you were typically getting up at 5 a.m. And if that's still the case, I understand that the market can move really early, especially now with the prevalence of regulated books back east.
Yeah.
Dave famously was an early riser. And when asked why, I think his response was, I like to win. And getting ahead of those market moves is a great way to put yourself in position to win. So I'm wondering, from your experience, if you could elaborate on the importance of winning the morning as a bettor and perhaps a bit more broadly in life as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, I totally agree with Dave. I always among many things that I respected Dave. I always liked that he was one of those guys that was doing the 5 a.m. hit on VSiN on the Mitch and Pauly show.
He's their ace in the hole.
Yeah, I do that. I do that, a lot of that segment. Nobody here. I mean, this is a town that is asleep at 5 a.m. They're up until 5 a.m. and then they go to sleep. Where I just think it's a significant edge. Now that edge has been lessened because of what you mentioned, where it's an East Coast market now. So I almost feel like the necessity to wake up by at least 6 a.m. every single day. You have to. I mean, the market starts to move. So it's always, whether it was Dave laying out the groundwork on, showing you how to be successful. For me, it was, my grandpa I raised a farmer. So it's been in my DNA since birth. You wake up, early bird gets the worm. I just think you're fresher in the morning. I get beat down as the day goes on. So my mental capacity at 5 a.m. is just so much better than what it is even at 5 p.m. So it's another one where I agree with Dave wholeheartedly. I just think I personally operate better early than I do late.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And it's really tough for me to get up early. I imagine it's not easy for anybody, but I used to, for example, work out after work and just get into the gym on my way home and do what I could and then go home, eat and relax for the evening. I realized that I was often feeling rushed at that hour of the day, probably wasn't at my peak physically or mentally, and it was costing me some quality time in the evenings with my wife after work. So maybe the best New Year's resolution I've ever set and maintained was kind of just flipping on a dime and becoming a morning workout person 7 or 8 years ago. I feel like I'm probably physically better off for it. And I know that mentally and socially, just having that time freed up has really gone a long way. So a lot of benefits, whether it's to hit the betting boards or do anything else with those early morning hours. I think Jocko Willink has a great line from maybe his time with the Navy SEALs, but awake before the enemy. Something to that effect can really be a nice mantra to set the proper tone. And at the same time, Brad, a part 2 here with the Molinsky Minute to end this on a lighter note. Your Twitter profile picture, Chief Brody from Jaws. I know Dave was a fan of classic movies, and it's crazy to think that Jaws will celebrate its 50th anniversary next summer. My wife would argue that Jaws may be the best movie ever made about politics, which is a timely thought during this U.S. election cycle. I find it hard to disagree with her take if you pay attention to some of the key moments in that movie.
Yep.
Brad, when it comes to that Twitter profile photo, why is Chief Brody the way you've gone?
Well, it's funny. I could do podcasts on the movie Jaws. You mentioned the politics. Obviously, the mayor bungled it up, but obviously not enough where he's still the mayor in Jaws 2. So that doesn't say much about the voters there in Amity Island. But why is it? Well, I think it's the greatest movie ever. I'm not saying art piece, film. I think there's a difference between movies and film. Movie, popcorn, enjoying it. There's everything in that movie, whether it's horror, drama, comedy, it just hits everything. And so it's been my favorite movie since I was a kid, and it's still even though I've seen it probably 30 times, I've seen it in the theater 5 or 6 times, it's still my favorite movie.
Yeah, I'm happy to push back on certain takes, like the college football playoff being expanded is going to hurt the regular season. I'm not going to push back on you here. My wife and I have had a bit of a game this summer. She's the movie buff of the family, but thinking about flawless movies, to your point, not necessarily movies that bring everything to the table, but within the movie, there's no real downtime, nothing that really needs to be cut. All the fat has already been trimmed. And I feel like Jaws is one of those examples. Shawshank was another one that we were quick to identify. Agreed. To that end, beyond Jaws, any other favorite classic movies in your arsenal?
Oh, wow. I am more of a classic movie, guys. I'm really into the 90s right now, going through stuff I didn't see when I was a kid. One that I saw recently in the last couple of years, it's an older one in the 70s, but Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, I think is terrific. I think that's just one that most people probably haven't seen. Obviously, everyone's seen The Godfather and some of them. Another 70s movie, The Sting, some gambling.
That's on our list too. The Sting is one of our flawless movies. Yes.
Yeah. I love Robert Redford and Paul Newman. So Chinatown and The Sting, both 1974. And 74 also had a Godfather Part 2. So you don't have movies like that anymore, let alone 3 in 1 year.
Yeah, and when it comes to The Sting, a recent thought I had, I'm going to call myself out here. Earlier this week, I made the amateur move of inadvertently placing the wrong bet. So I follow somebody who's very well plugged into NFL preseason news. I think astute listeners can read the tea leaves just fine here, and was advised Green Bay Packers +1.5. I am multitasking. I see the Packers +1.5. I actually see a +2. I'm like, oh, even better. Let me grab that. I lock it in. I realized that was the line for Packers Eagles week 1 in Brazil. So I'm now overexposed on Green Bay week 1 because I didn't properly check my bet slip along the lines of The Sting. To place, not to win, to place. Always pay attention to what you're locking in before your money is down. Brad, going to go ahead and wrap things up on that note. I want to shout out the audience once again. Thank you to those of you who've tuned in live. If you're listening in podcast form, thank you for your time as well. I plan to be back next week with another special guest. This time we'll be previewing the NFL season to come. And in the meantime, again, if you're not doing so already, follow Brad on Twitter @BradPower7. Look for that Chief Brody profile picture. And if you're going to need a bigger bankroll, you've come to the right place. You can find his work on the Bet the Board podcast, with Hit the Books, at Covers, and at BradPowerSports.com. Brad, thank you for bringing your college football expertise back here to Props and Hops. Best of luck this coming season.
Thanks for having me.